outside, now.
What?
Don't
Why?
question me. Step out.
I just got home. I'm a physician.
Turn around. Hands behind your back.
You're arresting me? For what?
Disorderly conduct.
On my own porch?
You should have complied. This is illegal. Tell it to the judge.
The Bodycam timestamp reads 5:42 p.m. The sun hangs high, slanting across the porch boards, illuminating dust motes that float in the warm air. The camera jitters slightly as Officer Daniel Price adjusts his stance. Faint rustling of fabric. A radio chirps somewhere behind him. The sound is mundane, mechanical, but it adds an almost subconscious tension to the scene. Inside the doorway, Dr. Ashera Beckett leans against the frame, one hand clutching her keys, the other bracing herself against the wood. Her scrubs are wrinkled, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes exhausted. 14 hours at the hospital have taken everything from her: mental clarity, energy, patience. And yet, the sight of a uniformed officer standing uninvited on her porch is an entirely different kind of fatigue, one that grips the mind as tightly as the body. Her first words are quiet, soft, almost hesitant. "What's going on?" No immediate answer. Just a pause, charged and deliberate. Then Price responds, calm but firm. "Step outside." The words are simple, minimal, but they carry weight, a subtle insistence that this is not a conversation. Beckett's eyes widen. Her shoulders slump slightly as the tension coils in her chest. She blinks rapidly, trying to reconcile the day's exhaustion with the sudden, inexplicable confrontation. "Why?" she asks. "Is something wrong?" Price steps closer, the porch narrowing. The Bodycam rocks slightly with each step. "Ma'am, step outside now." The moment is deceptively ordinary, yet every microsecond radiates tension. In law enforcement, commands carry authority. In civilian experience, commands without explanation feel threatening. Two realities collide on a small stretch of wooden boards under the daylight sun. Neither understands the other fully. Beckett takes a cautious half-step forward, just enough to meet him eye to eye. "I just got home," she says. "I'm a doctor. What's going on?" The camera captures the subtle shift in Price's stance. His shoulders square, feet widen, his voice tightens. "Turn around." The suddenness freezes Beckett mid-step. Confusion gives way to disbelief. "What?" she asks. "For what?" "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Price says. The porch is quiet now, not because the world paused, but because the human brain is acutely aware of threat. Beckett's face reflects the tension, the astonishment, the strain of fatigue, the disbelief of someone confronted with authority yet given no explanation. "You're arresting me?" she asks. "I didn't do anything." "You're being detained for disorderly conduct," Price replies. Those words, simple yet loaded, mark the hinge of the encounter. Disorderly conduct, a charge that is broad, subjective, and, in this instance, unmoored from any visible act. Beckett's body doesn't resist. She asks questions. She seeks clarity. But in that split second, authority perceives hesitation as defiance. Compliance is equated with legality. Inquiry is equated with resistance. "I'm on my own property," she says. "I just got home from work. This doesn't make sense." "Turn around," Price repeats. His hand moves toward his cuffs. Beckett looks at her hands, then back at him. "This is illegal," she says quietly. "You can't just." Hands behind your back. Metal clicks. The sound is small, mechanical, but it resonates in the quiet afternoon air like a judgment. Beckett winces, not from pain, but from the sudden collision of reality and expectation. Her hands are behind her back. Her shoulders tense. Her mind races to understand what just happened. The Bodycam perspective captures every detail. The tension in her jaw, the shallow intake of breath, the quiet absurdity of being handcuffed on her own porch. Observers later will see a scene charged with moral and procedural conflict. A tired doctor, a uniformed officer, a legal gray area collapsing into human consequence. Price escorts her toward the patrol car. 17 seconds of questioning, 17 seconds of repeated phrases, disorderly conduct. Beckett's voice shifts from confusion to hurt. "You didn't even tell me why you were here," she says. You can explain it to the judge, Price responds. Those words, intended as procedural closure, carry a different weight entirely. They mark the transformation of uncertainty into a tangible punishment. In real time, no crime has been articulated. No explanation has been offered. Only the perception of authority acting on incomplete information. Only the collision of exhaustion, stress, and procedural rigidity. Inside the patrol car, Beckett tries to adjust, uncomfortable and disoriented. The rear window reflects a neighborhood that seems unchanged. The ordinary, porches, cars, neighbors, remains. Nothing outwardly violent has occurred, yet everything has shifted. A day of saving lives ends with handcuffs. Authority, in its most literal and abstract form, has arrived at her doorstep and rewritten the rules of her evening. From Price's perspective, he was responding to a disturbance call. He believed he was maintaining control, protecting the public. From Beckett's perspective, she had just survived 14 hours of life-and-death decisions and is now being detained without explanation. The Bodycam records both realities with cold accuracy. Human interpretation, emotion, and judgment fill in the gaps, and that is where chaos begins. Later, psychologists reviewing the footage will note the subtle interplay of stress. Beckett's is cognitive and emotional, fatigue, confusion, shock. Price's is procedural, perceived loss of control, adherence to training, authority heuristics. Both are valid in isolation. Both are dangerous when combined. Both collide on a porch in a quiet residential street under sunlight. And that collision, brief and unremarkable on first glance, is enough to ignite consequences that ripple through careers, reputations, and systems. At 4:46 p.m., Price radios dispatch, one in custody. Female, disorderly conduct. No threat, no violence, no weapon, no ongoing disturbance. Only a body cam recording an ordinary afternoon transformed into an extraordinary legal and social event. And the question lingers, how did this happen? To answer that, we must rewind. Not minutes, not seconds, hours, to the 911 call that set everything in motion. Because nothing about this encounter truly began on that porch. It began with concern, a voice on the other end of a line, and a set of interpretations that neither party would anticipate. Before that porch confrontation, before the metal of the handcuffs pressed into her wrists, Dr. Ashera Beckett had a life defined by precision, care, and responsibility. She was a physician, a specialist whose days began long before the sun rose and often ended long after it had set. 14-hour hospital shifts were normal for her, sometimes more. Life and death decisions were routine. Her expertise demanded calm under pressure, a mind capable of rapid assessment, and a heart committed to saving strangers whose lives were in jeopardy. That day had been no different. Beckett moved from patient to patient, administering care, making critical judgments, delivering bad news and hope in equal measure. She carried herself with a quiet authority born of experience, yet one grounded in empathy. Her life, professional and personal, had rhythm, a careful balance of duty, responsibility, and rest, though that rest often came in short increments. Home was her refuge, a place where she could shed her professional armor and breathe, until the knock on her door shattered that sanctuary. Across the porch, Officer Daniel Price had a life defined by structure, rules, and the responsibility of maintaining public order. His training had taught him to act quickly, decisively, and with authority. His uniform was a symbol of power, but it was also a burden. Every call was a potential hazard, every civilian interaction a potential escalation. Officers are taught to scan, to categorize, to anticipate threats, sometimes in fractions of a second. Decision-making under pressure is part of the job, but so is accountability, though often delayed. Price was performing what he believed to be his duty. A call of a potential disturbance had come through dispatch, vague and uncertain. His perception, shaped by training, heuristics, and experience, interpreted the mundane as possibly dangerous. And yet, perception is not truth. It is a lens, colored by assumptions, stress, and context. On that afternoon, two vastly different lenses would converge on a suburban porch, producing consequences neither could fully anticipate. The stakes were both personal and systemic. For Beckett, the immediate risk was humiliation, injury, or worse, her own safety in question despite her home being her domain. For Price, the stakes were adherence to protocol, maintaining perceived control, and the unspoken expectation that compliance would safeguard authority. But beyond the porch, there were wider implications: procedural standards, legal precedent, and public trust. This incident would not remain contained. It would ripple outward into the hospital, the police department, the courts, and ultimately the community. Even before the encounter, the context was layered. Beckett's home was ordinary, a suburban street lined with familiar neighbors, parked cars, the gentle hum of everyday life. A place where nothing extraordinary should occur. Yet ordinary places are often where extraordinary consequences are born, because assumptions about normalcy are fragile. What feels safe and routine to one person can feel unpredictable and threatening to another. Beckett's exhaustion amplified the dissonance. After hours of life-saving work, her cognitive bandwidth was stretched thin. Fatigue compromises the ability to assess threats, slows reaction time, and makes even small confrontations feel monumental. When an unexpected authority figure steps into that fragile space, the psychological impact is magnified. Price, on the other hand, carried the weight of procedural responsibility. Officers operate under what is sometimes called threat heuristics, mental shortcuts designed to detect danger quickly. When someone hesitates, questions a command, or fails to act in the expected manner, the brain interprets it as potential defiance. This is a survival mechanism in high-risk environments, but in low-risk settings, it can distort reality. That afternoon, the porch became an intersection of two worlds, one fatigued and seeking explanation, the other trained to perceive hesitation as escalation. Both perspectives were grounded in reality, but in conflict. Beckett's reality was exhaustion, curiosity, and disbelief. Price's reality was duty, authority, and perceived risk. Neither had the full context of the other's experience, and the collision of those perspectives was set to unfold in ways that would challenge law, ethics, and public perception. Beyond the individuals, the broader social and legal framework loomed. Arrests, body cams, and civil rights laws exist to balance authority and accountability, but the system is only as effective as the human judgment executing it. In Beckett's case, that judgment would be scrutinized not only in internal affairs investigations, but in courts, in media, and in the court of public opinion. Questions of legality, propriety, and bias would emerge, some immediately, others slowly, but all inevitably. This was not a story of crime in the traditional sense. There was no robbery, no assault, no chase. The danger was procedural and perceptual. The threat was misalignment between authority and compliance, between protocol and context, between stress and patience. And yet, the consequences would be tangible: handcuffs, charges, public scrutiny, and long-term professional implications. By situating the viewer in both worlds, the narrative begins to explore deeper questions. How do ordinary moments become legally and socially significant? How do split-second perceptions trigger cascades of consequence? And how does authority, even when well-intentioned, produce outcomes far beyond the intentions of those involved? Beckett and Price were not villains. They were professionals performing roles shaped by experience, expectation, and obligation. And yet, the scene that would unfold on that porch, a brief moment lasting barely a minute, would test the limits of procedure, patience, and perception. To fully understand what happened, we must examine not only the incident itself, but the life context, the psychological framework, and the systemic pressures that brought these two individuals together at that precise time. This is the story of a single door, a single knock, and a series of decisions that reverberated far beyond a suburban street. It begins with ordinary lives intersecting under extraordinary tension. Lives shaped by duty and expectation. Lives shaped by fatigue and stress. Lives shaped by authority and accountability. And in those intersections, the stage was set, not just for an arrest, but for a narrative that would challenge assumptions about legality, safety, and justice. The porch confrontation, the handcuffs, the officer's commands, they are the visible tip of a deeper, more complex story. To fully grasp it, we must rewind to the moment that set everything in motion. The 911 call that seemed ordinary but would trigger extraordinary consequences. Because nothing about what happened on that porch was random. It was procedural. It was psychological. It was social. And it was legal. To understand the magnitude of what followed, we need to explore every layer, from the call to the response, from perception to consequence, from authority to accountability. That is where the story truly begins. The story, as many do, begins not with confrontation but with perception. On the afternoon of that pivotal day, a neighbor, concerned but uncertain, picked up a phone and dialed 911. The call was brief, hesitant, filled with fragmented sentences and uncertainty. "Hi, I think someone's yelling," the caller said. "I'm not sure, maybe an argument? I don't see anyone fighting, but it sounds like shouting." The dispatcher listened, trained to distinguish urgency from ambiguity, then logged it as a possible disturbance. There were no reports of weapons, no immediate danger, no active threat, simply voices, raised, perhaps frustrated, but within the realm of everyday life. The call was categorized appropriately as a low-priority check. Yet for the officer responding, even a low-priority disturbance carries inherent responsibility. Officer Daniel Price was on the street that afternoon, solo, bodycam activated, radio on, patrol car running. He had responded to countless calls, each one a test of judgment. And now, he had a report, raised voices in a quiet neighborhood. The precise location was noted. He headed there, scanning for anomalies, observing, anticipating. The bodycam captures the moment Price exits his vehicle. Footsteps on asphalt, slight rustling of fabric, the soft hum of tires still cooling. The camera shakes gently with his movement. The street appears empty, quiet, nothing overtly threatening. The shadows are long in the late afternoon sunlight, stretching across lawns and parked cars. A typical suburban scene. And yet, for Price, something in the environment demands attention. Something unarticulated, sensed, but not confirmed. A cautionary alert embedded in every officer's training. Price canvasses the street. He knocks on the first door, no answer. A second door, silent again. And then movement at the far end of the block. Scrubs, a bag over the shoulder, keys in hand. Someone clearly returning home after a long day. That someone is Dr. Ashara Beckett. From her perspective, she had just ended a 14-hour shift, her body and mind exhausted. She had washed her hands, removed her mask, and was settling into the quiet rhythm of home life. The sight of a uniformed officer, alone, bodycam recording, waiting at her doorstep, was jarring. Confusion surged first, followed by caution. For Price, Beckett's movements were an anomaly. Her hurried pace, her inward focus, her lack of immediate acknowledgement, it all fit a pattern officers are trained to notice: perceived avoidance, potential noncompliance. In real time, the mind fills in gaps. He does not know her identity. He does not yet see her exhaustion. He sees movement unaccompanied by explanation. His training instructs him to act decisively. And so he approaches the porch, knocks sharply, announces himself. The door opens. The confrontation begins, not with hostility, but with tension. Beckett's initial words are not accusatory, not defensive. They are questions. "What's going on?" she asks. The tone is calm, almost measured, but beneath it is the strain of disbelief. She is tired, she is alert, and she is questioning why a uniformed officer stands on her threshold. Price's response is simple, precise: step outside. The command is firm but controlled. His posture is rigid, authoritative. He does not yell. He does not escalate unnecessarily. Yet the weight of authority hangs in the space between them, an invisible pressure that Beckett immediately senses. It is in these seconds that perception and reality diverge. Beckett interprets the command through the lens of fatigue and routine. She has just arrived home. She is a homeowner. She has done nothing wrong. Compliance is not refusal, it is disbelief. For Price, hesitation is defiance. Cognitive bias is already at work. He perceives challenge where there is inquiry, and uncertainty where there is exhaustion. As the seconds stretch, small gestures become magnified. Beckett shifts her weight, grips her keys, blinks rapidly, and takes a small step forward, half curiosity, half caution. Price mirrors the movement, closing distance, reinforcing command. The camera records it all, each micro-expression, each subtle adjustment of stance, each tightening of the jaw. It is unremarkable in isolation, but charged with consequence in context. Dispatch remains in the background, a silent observer. Radio chirps. Other units check in elsewhere. The world continues as usual. But on this porch, in this sunlit moment, two lives are about to collide under procedural authority and human stress. Price reiterates his command, step outside now. He does not provide explanation. He does not articulate probable cause. In his mind, the request is lawful, reasonable, and necessary. For Beckett, the omission is jarring. Why is she being ordered off her property without cause? Why is explanation withheld? She asks questions. Why? Is something wrong? I just got home. Each inquiry intensifying the officer's perception of resistance. From a psychological perspective, this is exactly when escalation becomes likely. Authority threat response activates, narrowing perception. Cognitive bias compounds stress. The brain interprets noncompliance as risk, even when there is none. Commands become sharper. Options for dialogue shrink. Empathy is filtered through training, not observation. Beckett takes another step, seeking clarity, seeking reasoning. Price steps closer, tightening spatial control. The threshold becomes a line of tension, an invisible boundary where ordinary misunderstanding teeters on the edge of legal consequence. Within these moments, the mechanics of power are clear. Authority commands space. Compliance is expected. Questioning authority, intentional or not, intersects with procedural rules and psychological heuristics. And in that intersection, the law, perception, and human behavior collide. The stage is set. The call, the dispatch, the arrival. They have all built toward a single point, the porch. The sun is still high, light stretching across boards. The camera shakes slightly. Footsteps, rustling fabric. The first words exchanged. And just beyond the doorway, two interpretations of reality meet. What happens next, handcuffs, charges, reputational impact, is born from this moment of intersection. But to fully understand it, we must examine the human factors, the training, and the misperceptions that converged that afternoon. This was not random. It was systemic, procedural, psychological, and profoundly consequential. The porch is narrow, just enough space for two adults to stand facing each other. Yet in that small area, the emotional weight of authority and confusion is magnified. The afternoon sunlight casts sharp lines along the porch boards, emphasizing the boundary between the house and the outside world. The Bodycam captures every detail, the subtle tremor in Dr. Beckett's hands, the tightening of Officer Price's jaw, the micro-adjustments of their feet. Everything is ordinary, yet everything is consequential. Dr. Ashera Beckett grips her keys in one hand, resting the other against the doorframe for support. Her posture is upright but exhausted. Her scrubs are wrinkled, evidence of a grueling day at the hospital. Her breathing is steady but strained, her mind racing to reconcile two conflicting realities: the safety of her home and the unexpected presence of a police officer demanding compliance. Price stands on the porch with measured authority. One hand hovers near his belt, fingers brushing against his radio and cuffs. His tone is firm but controlled, a voice meant to assert control without immediate escalation. He repeats the command, "Step outside now." The camera tilts slightly, showing the distance between them shrinking. Each step, each glance, each shift in posture is recorded in high fidelity. Beckett hesitates. Her instinct is not defiance, but inquiry. She asks, "Why? What's going on?" The words are calm, patient, but they carry the strain of exhaustion and disbelief. She has just returned from a 14-hour shift where decisions carried life-and-death consequences, and now she is being ordered off her own porch without explanation. Price perceives hesitation differently. His brain, primed by years of training, interprets the delay as noncompliance. Cognitive heuristics, mental shortcuts designed to aid rapid decision-making, activate. In high-stress situations, officers are taught to equate hesitation with risk. In this case, perception and reality diverge sharply. Beckett is not resisting. She is questioning. But to Price, the question itself feels like opposition. "Ma'am, step outside now." Price repeats, voice firm, posture square. The Bodycam shakes slightly as he steps forward. His shadow stretches across the porch boards, a visual assertion of authority. Beckett's eyes widen. She takes a small step forward, not onto the ground, not toward him, just enough to gauge the intent behind the command. The gap between the command and understanding grows with every heartbeat. The psychology of escalation is subtle but powerful here. Beckett's cognitive stress, confusion layered with fatigue, collides with Price's procedural stress, control layered with vigilance. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, is firing in both individuals, but for different reasons. Beckett's threat is existential. Why is my home no longer safe? Price's threat is procedural. Will noncompliance jeopardize safety? The interaction is a perfect storm of misaligned perceptions. Beckett speaks again, softer this time. "I just got home. I'm a doctor. What's happening?" Her words are meant to clarify, to de-escalate, to bridge the gap between confusion and authority. Yet for Price, any delay in action is risk. His training reinforces immediacy. Commands must be followed. Compliance ensures control. "Turn around," he says abruptly. His posture stiffens, his feet widen, signaling escalation. The Bodycam tilts slightly, capturing Beckett's sudden freeze. The word is short, sharp, and devoid of explanation. Beckett's eyes scan his face, searching for context. "What?" she asks, voice tinged with shock. "For what?" This is the critical pivot point. In policing, perception of resistance triggers immediate recalibration. Officers are trained to narrow options, prioritize control, and prepare for physical engagement if necessary. Price moves his hand toward his cuffs, signaling intent to detain. Beckett instinctively looks down at her hands, then back up, processing the sudden shift from inquiry to arrest. "You're being detained for disorderly conduct," he says. The words are precise, procedural, yet their impact is profound. Disorderly conduct is a charge broad enough to encompass real disruption. But here, on a private porch, Beckett has done none of the behaviors traditionally associated with it. She has not shouted. She has not threatened. She has asked questions. Yet the legal framing now transforms ordinary interaction into alleged criminal conduct. The click of metal follows almost immediately. The Bodycam records the moment the cuffs close around Beckett's wrists. Her shoulders tense, not from pain, but from disbelief. Her voice breaks the silence. "You're arresting me on my own porch?" The question hangs in the air, rhetorical and incredulous. Price's response is procedural. "You should have complied." The phrase, repeated in departmental training and law enforcement rhetoric, crystallizes the tension between obedience and legality. Compliance, in theory, maintains safety. In practice, it overrides explanation. Beckett's confusion, her legitimate inquiry, becomes legally irrelevant in this moment. Neighbors begin to notice. Curtains twitch. Doors open slightly. Phones are raised. The Bodycam captures these peripheral details, the distant hum of street traffic, the faint murmur of concern, but they are secondary to the psychological theater unfolding in the foreground. Every gesture, every micro-expression, every posture communicates intent and reaction. Beckett is escorted down the porch steps, the camera tilting to show each movement. Her steps are careful, measured, but the tension is palpable. The commands are repeated, disorderly conduct. She asks again, "Why am I being arrested?" Each repetition reinforces the legal framing while ignoring the human need for explanation. The arrest is procedural, the trauma is real. This moment encapsulates the collision of systems and individuals. Authority meets questioning. Procedure meets exhaustion. Compliance meets perception. And the body cam, silent witness, records the entire narrative, impartial yet profoundly revealing. As the walk to the patrol car concludes, the silence is thick. Beckett's voice shifts from disbelief to hurt. "You didn't even tell me why you were here." Price's response is terse. "You can explain it to the judge." A simple sentence, procedural in tone, but laden with consequence. It transforms a moment of confusion into a formalized, documented encounter. In these seconds, the narrative diverges. What happened is no longer just a misunderstanding. It is now a record, a precedent, a moment captured for legal review, media analysis, and historical recounting. The porch, ordinary minutes earlier, becomes a locus of systemic scrutiny. And yet, neither party fully grasps the long-term impact. Beckett does not yet understand how this arrest will ripple into her career. Price does not yet foresee the scrutiny his actions will invite. The body cam records everything, impartial and unyielding, but the consequences are only beginning to unfold. The patrol car doors slam shut. The metallic echo resonates in the quiet residential street, a sound both final and procedural. Dr. Ashera Beckett sits in the back, wrists cuffed, shoulders slumped, her mind replaying the confrontation on her porch. The body cam remains outside, capturing only her reflection in the tinted window, an image of ordinary life interrupted by extraordinary consequence. The drive to the precinct is short but loaded with tension. Beckett's voice breaks the silence. "Why am I being arrested? What did I do?" The questions are rhetorical in part. In part, they are survival mechanisms. She is trained to analyze risk, to respond to emergencies, to assess chaos. Now, the chaos is internal. The answers she seeks are procedural, yet they are delayed, obfuscated by policy, protocol, and the weight of authority. Upon arrival, Beckett is guided through the booking process. Her name is logged, her fingerprints scanned. A photograph is taken, capturing her face in the fluorescent glare of a holding cell. The process is mechanical but transformative. The paperwork, the badge numbers, the electronic entries, each one reduces her presence in the system to a series of codes and charges. Disorderly conduct, resisting without violence. These words, precise and procedural, fail to capture the emotional and professional stakes of the encounter. She is asked routine questions. Where does she live? Who is her employer? The details of her life, once private and secure, are now documented and scrutinized. The officer at the desk is neutral, almost detached. This is standard procedure. Yet for Beckett, every question underscores the gap between law and lived reality. She had not threatened anyone. She had not acted aggressively. She had only returned home. And yet, in the official record, she is no longer simply a physician. She is a detainee, a subject, a statistic. 2 hours pass in the holding cell. Beckett is left alone to process. Her wrists ache from the restraints. Her shoulders stiffen. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant clatter of other detainees, the low murmur of radios. It all becomes a soundtrack to an unfolding trauma. Researchers later describe this as institutionalized disorientation, a psychological state induced when ordinary routines are replaced by rigid procedural environments. Beckett experiences it in real time. The body, trained for high-stakes decision-making, now restrained and passive. The mind, used to control and agency, now subject to others' authority. Her legal team is notified. The hospital is alerted. Internal protocols require disclosure for any arrest, especially one involving allegations of disorderly conduct. The ripple effect begins immediately. Supervisors send messages, colleagues call, administrators inquire. Beckett's phone vibrates constantly, each alert a reminder that what began as a private encounter has entered the public and professional spheres. The arrest report arrives days later. Beckett reads the words and feels a disconnect so profound it almost defies comprehension. She is described as uncooperative, argumentative, and disruptive. She refused lawful commands. She interfered with an investigation. None of these statements align with the bodycam footage. None match her recollection of calm, measured inquiry. And yet, these words are now part of her permanent record, shaping perceptions before evidence or context can intervene. The legal implications are immediate. In medicine, credentialing and professional evaluation are continuous and meticulous. Any arrest triggers mandatory review. Beckett's hospital privileges are temporarily restricted. She is removed from patient care for 3 weeks. 3 weeks without income, without the ability to practice, without explanation beyond a brief internal notice. Professional identity, built over years of training, dedication, and service, is suddenly fragile. Beckett requests the bodycam footage. Initially, the department resists. Citing ongoing investigation and privacy concerns, they deny access. Her attorney files a formal public records request. Weeks pass. Anxiety mounts. When the footage is finally released, Beckett watches it in her lawyer's office. She sees herself, fatigued, confused, asking questions calmly. She sees Price, firm, procedural, escalating. She sees the reality of the encounter, ordinary, quiet, yet misrepresented in every report. The footage becomes both shield and weapon. It proves her compliance and highlights procedural failures. Yet it also crystallizes the emotional toll. Watching herself restrained, walking from her porch, answering questions under duress, Beckett experiences what psychologists call secondary trauma, witnessing her own vulnerability in a way that magnifies stress rather than alleviates it. Meanwhile, Officer Price's reality diverges. From his perspective, he acted within training, within procedure. He reviewed the encounter multiple times, replaying it in his mind, reconstructing it according to memory rather than bodycam evidence. Cognitive bias, memory reconsolidation, shapes his recollection. He believes he acted appropriately, yet the evidence contradicts perception. The dissonance between belief and reality becomes a source of professional and personal tension, one that will influence every subsequent interaction with supervisors, union representatives, and legal counsel. Beckett's attorney submits the footage to the district attorney. Within 48 hours, the charges are dropped. Nal Proska will not prosecute. Legally, she is free. Emotionally, professionally, and socially, she is far from restored. The arrest, although void of criminal consequence, leaves a trace in the professional ecosystem. Hospital administrators conduct internal reviews. Colleagues whisper. Supervisors ask questions. Reputation, once a private construct, becomes public vulnerability. But the fallout extends beyond the individual. Internal affairs opens an investigation. Policy reviews are triggered. Training protocols scrutinized. The department must reconcile its procedures with public scrutiny. Beckett's case exposes systemic vulnerabilities, how minor misunderstandings escalate, how procedural adherence can clash with individual rights, how bodycam evidence, once unavailable, shifts accountability dramatically. Beckett herself begins to navigate recovery. She consults with therapists, speaks with civil rights organizations, and gradually reclaims her narrative. The psychological work is ongoing. Trauma, even without physical injury, leaves indelible marks. Hypervigilance, heightened startle response, and persistent anxiety become part of her daily experience. Yet she channels these experiences into advocacy, emphasizing procedural clarity, patient and citizen safety, and the importance of documented accountability. The arrest, though brief, becomes a lens for examining broader societal dynamics, power, authority, and the fragile boundary between lawful command and individual rights. It becomes a cautionary tale about how ordinary citizens can become enmeshed in legal processes and how documentation, video, reports, transcripts can either distort or clarify truth. By the end of this chapter, one truth is undeniable. A moment on a porch, a single encounter captured on Bodycam, can ripple outward to affect careers, reputations, mental health, and public trust. Beckett's life, once defined by clinical precision and patient care, is now interwoven with legal strategy, media narratives, and systemic scrutiny. And all of it began with a knock at the door. Once the Bodycam footage was released and the criminal charges dropped, Dr. Ashera Beckett faced a new reality. Freedom from criminal liability did not erase the professional, emotional, and systemic consequences of her arrest. The release of the footage made her case public, sparking widespread attention. Headlines highlighted the paradox of a physician arrested on her own porch for what appeared to be verbal noncompliance. The narrative became as much about policing protocols as it was about individual accountability. Beckett's attorney immediately filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. The complaint named Officer Daniel Price, the police department, and supervisory officials as defendants. It alleged unlawful detention, false arrest, violation of Fourth Amendment rights, and racial discrimination. Each allegation carried both legal and social weight, and the language of the filing emphasized the procedural failures evident in the Bodycam footage. It was precise, meticulous, and designed to hold the system accountable, not just the individual officer. The filing triggered a legal cascade. The department's legal team responded swiftly, asserting that Price acted within his discretion, that Beckett had failed to comply with lawful commands, and that officer safety justified his actions. They invoked qualified immunity, a doctrine that shields officers from civil liability unless a clear constitutional violation is established. From their perspective, the arrest was reasonable. From Beckett's perspective, it was the opposite, a violation of rights with cascading consequences. Court proceedings began with motions to dismiss, discovery disputes, and extensive debates over the admissibility of evidence. The Bodycam footage, central to the case, became a focal point in both filings and public discourse. The visual record highlighted the discrepancy between official reports and the reality of the encounter. While reports described Beckett as uncooperative and disruptive, the footage told a different story. A tired physician asking questions, seeking clarity, complying with instructions as best she could, and yet treated as a threat. Throughout pretrial proceedings, procedural arguments dominated. Defense attorneys challenged the interpretation of disorderly conduct, emphasizing the subjectivity of the charge. Beckett's team countered with precedent, showing that arrests solely based on verbal noncompliance or failure to immediately obey commands were inconsistent with constitutional standards. Expert witnesses were brought in to testify on policing practices, cognitive bias, authority threat response, and escalation in low-risk encounters. These experts contextualized Price's behavior not as uniquely malicious, but as emblematic of systemic issues within law enforcement training and culture. Media coverage intensified. News outlets dissected every clip, every utterance, every movement on the porch. The narrative evolved from a singular incident to a case study in the potential consequences of unchecked authority. Public opinion was divided. Some argued that the officer acted prudently, following training in a moment he perceived as noncompliance. Others saw a clear misuse of power, a preventable escalation that upended an innocent professional's life. This public attention amplified the stakes, not only for Beckett but for the department itself. Negotiations began behind the scenes. Settlement talks were tentative at first, with legal teams weighing risk, precedent, and potential financial exposure. Beckett's attorneys emphasized not just damages for emotional distress and professional harm, but systemic reform. The goal was to ensure that her experience would catalyze changes preventing similar occurrences in the future. The department, wary of public backlash and further scrutiny, considered policy adjustments alongside financial settlement. Internal discussions revealed deeper structural concerns. Departmental training, escalation protocols, and reporting standards were analyzed. Supervisory oversight, particularly regarding arrests at private residences without articulated probable cause, was scrutinized. The bodycam footage exposed the limitations of procedural reliance without context or explanation. Each image, each gesture, each command highlighted a gap between policy and practice. Months passed. Legal filings accumulated. Expert reports were submitted. Discovery involved hours of depositions from Beckett, Price, dispatch operators, supervisors, and internal affairs investigators. The legal machinery moved deliberately, with precision, dissecting each second of the encounter. Every transcript, every detail was evaluated for its relevance to Fourth Amendment protections, reasonable officer standards, and the potential for civil rights violations. Eventually, a settlement was reached. The city agreed to pay Dr. Asherah Beckett $675,000. No admission of wrongdoing was made. No formal apology was issued, but policy changes were implemented as part of the resolution. Mandatory de-escalation training became standard. Arrest procedures for verbal noncompliance at private residences were clarified. Officers were required to articulate probable cause on bodycam before detaining individuals. Supervisor review was mandated for arrests without warrants. And public transparency policies were revised to allow bodycam footage to be released in civil rights cases. These reforms were operational, not symbolic. They changed how officers were trained, how arrests were evaluated, and how complaints were investigated. They also served as a testament to the potential of a single encounter to drive institutional change. Beckett's personal struggle became a catalyst for policy reform, demonstrating the power of documentation, persistence, and legal advocacy. Yet emotional and professional consequences persisted. For Beckett, the settlement did not erase anxiety, hypervigilance, or the trauma of sudden detainment. She returned to work, gradually reclaiming her daily routines, but the experience left an enduring mark. Patients, colleagues, and supervisors were aware, and her professional reputation required careful management. For Price, the aftermath was different but equally impactful. Following administrative review and internal pressure, he resigned. His career in law enforcement ended quietly, a professional withdrawal that carried personal consequences. The legal and civil outcomes underscore a larger societal lesson. Accountability extends beyond individual incidents. Systems, policies, training, and culture all play roles in shaping encounters between law enforcement and civilians. Beckett's case illustrates the importance of evidence, documentation, and advocacy in challenging procedural failure. It also demonstrates the long-term impact on both parties involved when authority is exercised without clarity or explanation. By the end of this chapter, one reality is clear: the intersection of law, procedure, and human behavior is complex. Legal resolutions, financial settlements, and policy changes can mitigate systemic failures, but they cannot erase the lived experience of those directly affected. Beckett's story serves as a cautionary tale, a blueprint for reform, and a lens through which the fragility of professional and personal trust can be examined. Once the bodycam footage went public, Dr. Asherah Beckett's story quickly became more than a single encounter. It became a mirror reflecting systemic challenges within law enforcement. Social media amplified the narrative, and hashtags began circulating, emphasizing accountability, de-escalation, and the rights of civilians. News outlets dissected every frame of the bodycam footage, replaying Beckett's words and Price's commands, highlighting the stark contrast between perception and reality. It was a story that provoked immediate emotional responses: shock, empathy, frustration, and curiosity. Community organizations and civil rights groups seized upon the case as an example of what they called authority overreach. Press conferences were held, op-eds written, and panel discussions convened to explore not only Beckett's experience, but broader trends in policing. Advocates pointed to research showing that verbal noncompliance, especially in low-risk residential encounters, often triggers disproportionate responses. The conversation shifted from Beckett's individual ordeal to structural vulnerabilities in law enforcement culture. Local politicians and city officials faced pressure. Constituents demanded transparency. Town hall meetings were convened where citizens expressed concern about personal safety and the right to question authority without fear of arbitrary detention. Community members shared their own experiences, stories of neighbors, friends, or family members who had encountered similar escalations in otherwise mundane situations. These narratives, though less visible than Beckett's, underscored the systemic nature of the problem. At the police department, internal discussions were intensified. Officers and leadership recognized that public perception mattered as much as procedural compliance. Surveys and reviews revealed a growing disconnect between community expectations and police practice. While officers had been trained in rapid response and command presence, the data indicated that excessive reliance on authority heuristics could lead to unnecessary escalation. The department began re-examining its training modules, focusing on situational context, communication strategies, and the use of discretion in nonviolent, low-risk encounters. Media coverage also highlighted disparities in how different demographics were treated during low-level encounters. Analysis showed that Black and Brown residents were disproportionately cited or detained for verbal noncompliance or perceived resistance. This fueled the argument that systemic biases, both conscious and unconscious, shaped decision-making in law enforcement. Beckett's case became a touchstone, not simply because of her identity or occupation, but because the body cam footage captured a scenario that contradicted departmental reports, revealing the human cost of misinterpretation and unchecked authority. Policy reform emerged as a central outcome. The city incorporated Beckett's case into a comprehensive review of arrest protocols. Mandatory de-escalation training was expanded to all officers, emphasizing verbal communication, active listening, and contextual assessment before resorting to physical intervention. Procedures for documenting probable cause and ensuring clear articulation of commands were revised. Officers were instructed to provide immediate explanation when detaining individuals, and supervisors were required to review arrests conducted without warrants at private residences. These changes were operational, not symbolic. They represented an acknowledgement that a single incident could expose vulnerabilities affecting hundreds of future interactions. Public engagement was crucial. Civil rights organizations hosted workshops and webinars for community members, explaining their rights during police encounters, how to request body cam footage, and the process for filing complaints. Beckett herself participated in these sessions, speaking candidly about her experience, not as a victim, but as an advocate for clarity and accountability. She stressed the importance of knowing one's rights and understanding that procedural errors could escalate quickly if left unchecked. Her presence added a personal, credible voice to systemic critique. The legal settlement, while significant, was just one component of broader reform. Financial compensation addressed immediate personal and professional losses, but the policy changes that followed were arguably more consequential. Mandatory de-escalation training, revised arrest protocols, and supervisory oversight created structural safeguards. Officers were now explicitly trained to pause, explain, and evaluate context, counteracting the cognitive shortcuts that often precipitated escalation. These reforms were tested in internal simulations, scenario planning exercises, and field evaluations. Feedback loops ensured that lessons from Beckett's case would inform future practice, not simply remain a historical footnote. Public opinion continued to evolve. While some initially framed the encounter as a simple misunderstanding, The depth of procedural failure became undeniable as expert analysis and bodycam footage circulated. Media coverage explored the nuance of authority heuristic, threat misattribution, and escalation bias. Articles detailed how exhaustion, stress, and professional identity interact in high-stakes environments, demonstrating that encounters like Beckett's were not merely the result of individual decisions, but of structural and psychological dynamics within law enforcement systems. Importantly, the settlement and policy changes had ripple effects beyond the city. Other municipalities took note, reviewing their own protocols and training procedures. Police reform advocates cited Beckett's case in hearings, policy proposals, and research papers. Law schools and criminal justice programs integrated the case as a study in civil rights, procedural justice, and bodycam accountability. The narrative extended beyond local headlines, influencing national discourse on policing practices, accountability, and civilian rights. Beckett's personal advocacy reinforced the human dimension of these systemic changes. She spoke at medical conferences, highlighting physician vulnerability in encounters with authority and emphasizing the intersection of professional identity and civil rights. Her story illuminated a broader societal question: how many citizens comply out of confusion or fear rather than understanding? How many officers escalate in routine situations due to cognitive shortcuts rather than imminent threat? These questions prompted reflection across professions, agencies, and communities. The psychological impact of the incident, for both Beckett and Price, remained profound. Beckett experienced hypervigilance, an awareness that her home, once a sanctuary, could suddenly become the site of coercion. Her medical colleagues observed subtle changes in behavior as she navigated the tension between professional obligation and personal trauma. For Price, the resignation and public scrutiny underscored the emotional and reputational consequences of procedural missteps. Both individuals were reminders that policy failure is not abstract, it is lived. By the end of this chapter, the public narrative had shifted. Beckett's story was no longer solely about her arrest. It had become a catalyst for policy reform, professional dialogue, and community awareness. The intersection of law enforcement, civil rights, and public trust had been exposed, and the reforms enacted, both locally and nationally, would influence countless encounters in the years to come. Beckett's experience also emphasized a key lesson for the public. Accountability depends on documentation, advocacy, and persistence. The bodycam footage did not prevent her arrest, but it enabled her to challenge systemic failures. Without it, the story could have been reduced to reports, interpretations, and assumptions, potentially leaving both individual and institutional accountability unresolved. And so, the porch encounter that began as a moment of confusion and stress transformed into a broader narrative of reform and reflection. It highlighted vulnerabilities in policing practice, illuminated the psychological mechanisms driving escalation, and demonstrated how one documented encounter can influence community, policy, and professional norms. After the arrest, life for Dr. Ashera Beckett did not simply return to normal. The settlement provided financial compensation and public acknowledgement of procedural missteps, but it could not erase the psychological and professional impact of being detained in her own home. Every moment of that encounter had left a subtle residue, shaping her behavior, her sense of security, and her perception of authority. Returning to work at the hospital brought both relief and tension. Beckett resumed patient care, yet even familiar routines carried reminders of vulnerability. The simple act of entering the hospital, sliding her ID badge, passing through security, reminded her of how quickly control over her own circumstances had been stripped. She found herself hyper-aware of others' movements, the tone of voices, and the pacing of interactions. Small noises, footsteps in hallways, unexpected taps on doors. These became triggers for fleeting but intense anxiety. She described it to her therapist as a form of hypervigilance, a persistent alertness that was neither fully conscious nor fully controllable. Colleagues noticed subtle changes as well. Beckett had always been assertive, confident, and decisive, qualities essential in her work as a physician. After the arrest, these traits persisted in patient care, but she exhibited caution in administrative interactions and external communications. Meetings with supervisors now carried an unspoken tension. She was acutely aware that her professional conduct could be scrutinized in ways it never had been before. Emails, phone calls, and even casual conversations were now filtered through an internal lens of self-preservation. The arrest had exposed the fragility of reputation, particularly for professionals operating in high-stakes environments. The hospital administration, while supportive, implemented temporary restrictions on Beckett's privileges as a precautionary measure. These were procedural safeguards designed to ensure compliance with internal reporting requirements. But to Beckett, they felt like an additional layer of scrutiny. Every patient she saw, every procedure she performed, came with the knowledge that her professional standing was, for the moment, suspended in a delicate balance. Though she had done nothing wrong, the arrest had created a ripple effect that disrupted her career trajectory and daily routines. Emotionally, Beckett grappled with conflicting feelings. Anger, initially raw, had moderated into a mix of resolve, reflection, and lingering frustration. The arrest had been a violation of her autonomy, yet it was also a lens through which she could analyze broader systemic flaws. Her experience illustrated the intersection of personal trauma and civic responsibility. She began engaging with civil rights groups, speaking at community forums, and participating in training sessions with law enforcement agencies. These engagements were not acts of revenge, they were acts of education, advocacy, and healing. By sharing her story, Beckett reclaimed agency over a narrative that had once been dictated by others. Her attorney emphasized the importance of this public engagement. In legal terms, documenting her advocacy demonstrated that the arrest had real-world consequences beyond the individual incident. In social and professional terms, it allowed Beckett to transform her trauma into a catalyst for change. Her story became a teaching tool, not merely about a single arrest, but about the human consequences of procedural failure, cognitive bias, and authority misinterpretation. The footage she had fought to release now served as an example in training programs, illustrating the importance of context, explanation, and measured response in policing. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Price faced his own aftermath, though in a different dimension. After resigning from the department, he moved to another state, seeking distance from the public scrutiny and institutional pressures that had accumulated. Professionally, he no longer patrolled neighborhoods, responded to calls, or carried the weight of public safety decisions. Psychologically, however, the incident remained present. The footage and legal proceedings forced him to replay every interaction, analyzing each decision, each verbal exchange, each subtle cue he had interpreted incorrectly. The incident had revealed not only procedural weaknesses, but also personal limitations, the gap between training, perception, and reality. Price's experience highlighted a central tension in law enforcement: the weight of responsibility versus the limitations of human perception. Officers are trained to act decisively under stress, to prioritize authority and compliance as proxies for safety. But when those heuristics are applied in low-threat situations, they can amplify misunderstandings rather than resolve them. For Price, this realization came with personal cost, resignation, reflection, and the recognition that a single misjudgment can ripple through careers, institutions, and communities. Back in her professional sphere, Beckett faced the enduring challenge of public perception. Media coverage had amplified the story, and while many applauded her advocacy, others speculated, criticized, or misunderstood the encounter. In the age of instant information, reputations are fragile, and even when the law sides with an individual, public judgment can remain unresolved. Beckett became acutely aware that professional validation, certifications, peer acknowledgement, and patient trust could be undermined not by misconduct, but by the mere occurrence of a publicized incident. Her emotional recovery was gradual. Therapy, mindfulness practices, and deliberate reflection helped her navigate the tension between vigilance and normalcy. She focused on rebuilding a sense of agency, recognizing that while the incident could not be undone, the lessons it imparted could shape her responses, her interactions, and her advocacy. Beckett also engaged in community outreach, mentoring young physicians and advocating for professional support systems that consider the psychological impact of encounters with authority. For the broader public, Beckett's journey illustrated the human stakes behind procedural failures. Financial settlements and policy changes, while important, could not fully restore personal sense of safety or professional autonomy. The story emphasized that accountability extends beyond the courtroom, into daily interactions, into the psychological fabric of those affected, and into institutional practices that either prevent or propagate harm. Ultimately, Beckett's story became a blueprint for resilience and systemic improvement. By navigating the legal, emotional, and professional aftermath, she demonstrated how individual advocacy, supported by documentation and legal action, can drive institutional change. Her experience underscored the importance of transparency, the power of bodycam evidence, and the necessity of integrating psychological insight into law enforcement training. It also highlighted a simple truth: authority, when unchecked or misunderstood, has real consequences for real lives. This chapter closes with the understanding that recovery is not linear, and that justice is not solely measured in settlements or policy changes. For Dr. Beckett, for Officer Price, and for the community, the emotional and professional aftermath extends far beyond the incident itself. It is embedded in routines, perceptions, and relationships. It shapes trust, influences behavior, and informs future encounters. And while policy reform addresses procedural gaps, the human element, the emotional, psychological, and professional impact, remains enduring. The arrest of Dr. Ashera Beckett, though singular in circumstance, quickly became emblematic of broader systemic challenges in policing, authority, and civil rights. Beyond the immediate legal case, her story illuminated recurring patterns in law enforcement procedures, cognitive biases, and institutional culture. It sparked questions not just about one officer or one department, but about the framework that governs police interactions across the country. At the core of the conversation is a simple yet profound tension: the balance between authority and accountability. Police officers operate in environments where decisions are made under stress, time pressure, and incomplete information. Training often emphasizes control, compliance, and decisive action, heuristics that save lives in violent encounters, yet can misfire in ordinary, low-risk situations. Beckett's encounter underscores that what works in high-risk scenarios can escalate conflicts unnecessarily when applied indiscriminately. Her arrest became a case study in how procedural adherence, without contextual judgment, can produce harm, even when intentions are not malicious. Psychologists and law enforcement trainers examining the footage pointed to a combination of cognitive and systemic failures. Officer Price exhibited what behavioral scientists describe as authority threat response, an automatic perception that noncompliance, even verbal inquiry, signals a challenge, prompting escalation. Simultaneously, departmental policies lacked safeguards for differentiating low-threat situations from imminent danger. There was no formal requirement for clear verbal explanation before detainment, no explicit mandate for observing signs of exhaustion, stress, or medical vulnerability. Beckett's presence on her own porch after a 14-hour hospital shift went unrecognized in the procedural framework, leaving the encounter vulnerable to misinterpretation. The broader implications became evident when advocacy groups began analyzing arrest patterns across the city. Statistical reviews revealed trends. Verbal noncompliance disproportionately escalated into detainment. Black residents experienced higher rates of arrest for ambiguous charges, and low-risk encounters frequently resulted in formal charges without clear probable cause. Beckett's case, amplified by bodycam footage and legal documentation, catalyzed this scrutiny, demonstrating that individual incidents often reflect systemic vulnerabilities rather than isolated errors. Body cams themselves emerged as a double-edged sword. In Beckett's case, the footage revealed the disparity between perception and reality, providing irrefutable evidence of procedural missteps. But body cams also highlighted how much authority and judgment rely on subtle cues, tone, posture, pacing, that are interpreted differently in real time. For law enforcement agencies, this raised difficult questions. How should officers be trained to manage perception under stress? How should footage be used proactively for training, not just retroactive scrutiny? And how can departments balance accountability with operational autonomy? National discussions followed. Media outlets compared Beckett's experience with other widely publicized cases of low-risk but high-impact police encounters. Commentators debated policy reforms, de-escalation mandates, and the limits of qualified immunity. Civil rights organizations used the case as evidence for legislative proposals requiring explicit articulation of probable cause before any detention, mandatory de-escalation training, and enhanced oversight for low-threat encounters. Training academies began incorporating cognitive bias modules, emphasizing situational awareness beyond procedural checklists. Beckett's case became a learning tool not just for one department, but for law enforcement agencies nationwide. The legal precedents also resonated. The city's $675,000 settlement, paired with mandatory policy changes, signaled that procedural missteps, even in absence of violence, carry tangible consequences. Departments could no longer rely solely on the claim of reasonable belief or procedural compliance. Documentation, communication, and context became equally critical. The case highlighted that compliance alone does not equate to legality, and that failure to articulate probable cause can undermine not only an individual officer's actions, but the credibility of the entire department. Beyond policy and law, Beckett's story prompted a re-evaluation of citizen interactions with authority. The arrest sparked national debate about rights, compliance, and personal agency. What does it mean to comply versus consent? How should citizens navigate encounters where authority is exercised but explanation is absent? Beckett herself became a voice for clarity, educating professionals about asserting rights without escalating conflict and emphasizing documentation as a tool for protection. This dialogue extended into healthcare, education, and other professional spheres. Professionals who might never have considered their vulnerability to misapplied authority began to examine protocols, security measures, and advocacy strategies. Hospitals, for example, revisited policies for staff interactions with law enforcement, emphasizing procedural clarity and legal awareness. Legal counsel encouraged proactive recording and documentation for any professional encountering unexpected authority, underscoring that personal safety and professional reputation are inextricably linked. The systemic lessons are nuanced. Accountability cannot rest solely on individual officers. It requires policy, training, oversight, and culture. Cognitive biases must be addressed through both instruction and institutional awareness. Departments must recognize that procedural adherence without context can generate harm equal to or greater than procedural neglect. And the public must understand that encounters with authority are not merely legal exercises. They are human interactions influenced by stress, perception, and systemic norms. For Dr. Beckett, the implications are deeply personal. She remains a practicing physician, yet her story is inseparable from the broader discourse on rights, authority, and systemic accountability. She continues public speaking, advocacy, and professional mentorship, ensuring that her experience informs both policy and perception. Her resilience illustrates a key point. While systemic flaws can create harm, documented advocacy, persistence, and engagement can drive meaningful change. Officer Price's trajectory also underscores systemic lessons. His resignation, professional recalibration, and reflection reveal the human cost of procedural misalignment. Beyond legal consequences, officers experience cognitive dissonance, reputational challenges, and professional uncertainty when systems fail to support nuanced judgment. Beckett's case highlights that systemic reform protects both citizens and officers, creating a framework where authority is exercised responsibly, ethically, and contextually. Ultimately, Beckett's encounter exemplifies the intersection of authority, vulnerability, and systemic responsibility. One moment, mere seconds on a residential porch, unveiled gaps in procedure, perception, and policy that ripple far beyond a single incident. It demonstrates how ordinary interactions can escalate into professional, legal, and societal consequences when systems are misaligned and human behavior is unmoderated. The story concludes not with the arrest, nor the settlement, but with reflection. It challenges viewers to consider the broader implications of authority, the weight of procedural failure, and the human cost of cognitive misalignment. Beckett's experience is a cautionary tale, a case study, and a catalyst for change, a reminder that systemic lessons are often embedded in the most ordinary moments. And those moments, if observed and understood, can drive reform that prevents future harm.